Hello, guys, and welcome to our lecture today. We will be talking about the Virginia House of Burgesses and about Bacon's Rebellion, which has nothing to do with bacon. I'm sorry. At least, the delicious breakfast meat, not that. All right. So first off, recall that Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. 1607, they land. They have a rough winter, the starving time. John Smith kind of is a leader, helps get them through. They're going to have issues with the local Powhatan people and Algonquin tribe. And the famous daughter, Pocahontas, will marry into the English group by marrying John Rolfe in 1614 and help to kind of bridge the gap there for a few years. Sadly, after she goes to England and meets the Queen and causes quite a kerfuffle, she dies of disease. So goes the way with most people back in this era. And so 1617, Pocahontas is dead, and 1618, her father, Powhatan, is killed. Oh, actually, sorry, he doesn't get killed, he dies, natural death, and his brother's going to take over. So that's 1618. Now, 1619, remember the Virginia Company, this joint stock company that has founded Jamestown, they are looking to recruit more settlers. They need a pull to get more people over here. They've had some women start to come over. And 1619, you're going to get also the first African slaves to come over for a cheaper labor source. You have indentured servants coming over, but they need recruits. And so one of the ways the Virginia Company is going to seek to recruit more English settlers was through having a representative assembly or government installed in the colony of Jamestown. And this is going to become the House of Burgesses. It's incredibly important to remember that this is the very first representative government for the English in the New World. And it's based off of the British Parliament system. So, in the British Parliament, that's kind of like our Congress. In fact, our Congress is based off of British Parliament. They have a prime minister that is chosen by the parliamentary members, but Parliament itself is made up of two houses. That's a house is cameral. That's bicameral structure. One of the houses, the lower house, is called the House of Commons, where British people, now at this time, usually men who were landowning, wealthy, of a certain stature, got to vote. That's the House of Commons. And then the House of Lords, that was a hereditary position. And so those are the two pieces to the British Parliament. Now, the House of Burgesses will be based on that. It doesn't get its second house until a bit later, but this is a significant deal. And you kind of had the Virginia companies royally appointed, well, after a certain amount of time, governor being the prime minister of Jamestown. And then you're going to have the Burgesses, who are these landowning, wealthy men elected by the plantation men. They're going to be deciding the laws for Jamestown. That's a significant thing. And that's also significant because remember that compared to the French and the Spanish, the English are the only country at this time that really has a limited form of monarchy. The others, the French and the Spanish, they have absolute monarchies. Everything that's going on in the colonies is directly up the chain of command to the king. But in England, Parliament does run the show. Ever since the Magna Carta, the power of the king has been limited. There's been certain kings, like famously Charles I, who is going to get his head cut off over this, who try to fight back. But ever since 1215, the Magna Carta, the English king's power is limited, and Parliament is the English government structure that calls the shots. So bringing this over to the Americas is going to kind of point towards why the United States is going to develop as such a unique experiment of democracy that will last and endure compared to a lot of these other places. Think about like revolutions in other countries that have happened, like in China or in France or many different places that they don't take. Well, that's because they didn't have experience with democracy, with people voting for their leaders and having a say. Versus in America, we're going to have experience well before the American Revolution, like 1619 to 1776. That's over 100 years, well over 100 years of experience in basically ruling ourselves. So that's one of the reasons why we will succeed. Also of note, there are going to be very few women coming over to the Chesapeake colonies, to Virginia, and to Maryland. So those women that did come over, they are going to have more rights than women in other colonies, just because of the numbers. Meaning that they could, if they were widowed, own land. They could make, sign their name and do legal agreements, but it's not going to be a perfect scenario. All right, so we left off with Powhatan dying after Pocahontas, 1618. His brother, Opechanocanu, takes over. And about 4 years into this, he has been plotting and planning because they've seen since 1607 that the English have no plans to hold back, that the English settlement has continued to expand and expand, and they're swallowing up the Powhatan's land. And so Opechancanough, he basically only is trying to give the English land that is purposely spread out. And in 1622, he finally launches his surprise attack, even going so far as to have his warriors go into the various settlements in and around Jamestown, looking unarmed, pretending to be there for trade, and then kind of simultaneously all grabbing whatever weapons were handy and then mass murdering as many Englishmen as they could. It was a terrible, terrible attack. And so there are bloody attacks on both sides. Remember that. But about a quarter of the English settlers in and around Jamestown are killed in 1622. And as a result of this, remember, news travels slowly across the Atlantic. King James is going to take over Jamestown from the Virginia Company in 1624. It becomes a royal colony, but it will still retain the House of Burgesses, that elected assembly. James and his successors, the kings of England, they will try to get rid of the Burgesses and that elected governance, but they will be unsuccessful. Again, one of the big advantages that the colonists have is the Atlantic Ocean. Opechancanoughh, if you're interested, he continues to be a thorn in the side of the Jamestown, Virginia settlement all the way until he is finally captured and executed via head being chopped off, I believe in 1644. That was Pocahontas's uncle. Okay, so remember 1619, the very first African slaves came to Jamestown. And they're working alongside in the fields in this English settlement alongside the indentured servants. Indentured servants were coming over from England. An indentured servant is someone who signs away their life for 5 to 7 years on a contract with the promise that once that contract has been served, their years have been served, they'll be freed and they will get that land guaranteed to them from the Virginia Company by the head right system. They will get those 50 acres. But recall that there's no incentive for the person who paid their way, basically, essentially their master, to treat them well. In fact, it works very advantageously for the master to let the indentured servant just die. Yeah, it's pretty cold because then the master gets those 50 acres of land and then he becomes richer and richer and it just builds off of it. So that system is basically going to continue to work that way for the next several decades from 18, 16, 19 when it's instituted all the way until 1676. You have a lot of indentured servants and African slaves working the land, being treated very poorly, and kind of in a lot of the similar circumstances. Now, you do have some that would survive and get their land. But the land that these indentured servants who survived would get would be the land that was on the outskirts of the settlements because that was land that was unprotected from Native American attacks. The Native Americans are on the western side of the settlement. You have the rich, landowning, wealthy, elite plantations there on the eastern side. The best land was by the coast. Why by the coast? Well, because of trade. You could get ships there. And so this is the situation as we come up to what's called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, not a pig, an actual person, actually pretty handsome, he was supposedly called. Dark hair, tall, if that's your thing. He is going to be actually pretty wealthy guy, but he has a soft spot for these indentured servants and their plight. And so in 1676, he rallies the indentured servants who own land on the western edges of the settlements who have been beleaguered and being picked off by Native American attacks. And he says, this isn't right. So they march on Jamestown to the House of Burgesses and basically demand that there be protection sent to them, that this is not fair. And William Barclay, sometimes spelled Berkeley, the governor of the Jamestown colony, basically denies Bacon and these indentured servants any protection or money or army to help them out. And Nathaniel Bacon was said to have lowered a gun at Barclay's heart, basically threatening the governor. And the governor bared his chest, saying, do your worst. And then Bacon, not willing to shoot the governor in front of everybody, then points his gun at the other Burgesses. And then they're like, oh, yeah, we'll do it. Sure. So some bravado there on both sides. But basically, this rebellion lasts for a few months, but it kind of whittles out because Nathaniel Bacon dies just 2 months into his rebellion in 1676. He dies from dysentery, which is a really poopy way to die, and that was a terrible pun, but I don't apologize for it. So, with Bacon dead, the rebellion peters out. Now, the big impact here is what the House of Burgesses and the landowning elite are going to do because of these indentured servants rising up against them. They have incredible fear that the power of the indentured servants combined with that of the African slaves, if they were to combine forces, so to speak, they would be able to overpower the landowning elites. And so, to prevent that, that's where you're going to get eventually, as a result of this, the Virginia slave codes, which are going to start to create more of a racial divide between indentured servants and African slaves to kind of keep those groups from coming together. Because potentially, if they rose up together, they could be a very powerful force. And so that is where you start to get the really, really racist, really terrible form of Southern slavery as we get into the antebellum era, the old South era, leading up to the Confederacy and the Civil War and all of that. Because at first, African slaves were seen more as kind of indentured servants. And they could even win their freedom. They could have certain measures of rights. But all of that begins to change here because of this fear and social stratification, racial divides, those become cemented in this Chesapeake society. It becomes extremely hierarchical with the landowning elite at the top. And then you're going to have artisans and a middle class, a very small middle class. Then you're going to have indentured servants. And then at the bottom, you will have the African slaves. To round up the Chesapeake colonies, let's briefly talk about Maryland real quick. Maryland today is where the District of Columbia is, D.C., our capital. Originally, Maryland was established in 1632 as a proprietary colony. And that means that it was a colony under the control of a single individual. It was actually this giant tract of land, part of the original Virginia settlement, that was given to George Calvert, who was a Catholic. He had been the Secretary of State for England, but due to his coming out as a Catholic during, remember all this religious turmoil between Catholics and Protestants with Henry VIII and then Mary and then Elizabeth, due to all of that, he wants to get the heck out of there. And the king, who is a he sympathizes with George Calvert. He originally granted him land up in Nova Scotia. That's on the east coast in Canada above Maine. But it was said that Calvert stepped foot in Nova Scotia and then he got back on his ship and he told the king, I don't want that. It's too cold. And there you go. So he gets this northern part of the Virginia settlement, a giant tract of land to rule as he sees fit. And he wants to make it kind of a Catholic sanctuary. He dies before he's able to do that. So it's going to be his son, Cecilius Calvert, who will actually inherit the land and seek to do what his father had intended. And Maryland becomes a Catholic colony, basically. However, it's going to have a lot of Anglicans, a lot of Protestants who are going to also be immigrating. So, because of this religious tension in the colony, eventually in the 1640s, a Religious Toleration Act, the Maryland Toleration Act, is passed by the Calverts. And that was really to protect the Catholics in the colony. And the funny thing is that this Toleration Act actually said that you had to worship the Trinity. It protected all Christians that worship the Trinity. The Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. You had to see Jesus as a deity. If you did not, under the Religious Toleration Act, the penalty was death. So, good job on toleration there, Maryland. Again, this time period, it's defined by religious strife and turmoil, death, disease. Very different from our own time period, but in some ways you see the lingering remains. Also, don't forget the big picture. Remember we talked about the Spanish, the GGG of it all, and what the Jamestown settlers originally had come over here for. It's all about making profits. For Jamestown, they found that with tobacco. Maryland is right north of Virginia. They're also going to be all about that tobacco for making money. The interest of any group is to seek a profit. So there you go. We got Virginia done. We got Maryland done. Thank you guys. I'll see you or talk to you next time.